We're going to attack the formidable Dogen today. So this is I gave a little short talk on him, but this is actually the first talk in a series. We're going to do Genjo Koan. So Genjo Koan is part of his longer work, the Shobogenzo, which is the treasury of the true Dharma I. It has 95 chapters. It's quite hefty and was written over his whole lifetime. It was basically, it was a refined written version of his teachings to his students. He revised these pieces and the order in which he placed them several times. So we're not always really sure, which is the authentic revision. So we just take a guess. So according to scholars, Dogen completed this Genjo Koan in 1233. He was a 13th century monastic Japanese, studied in China, and brought what he thought was like true Zen back to Japan. He, after he completed this Genjo Koan, he gave it to his lay student, Yokoshu. It's kind of significant for us since we're all lay practitioners. So he was meaning this for lay students. This was the first chapter of the Shobogenzo that he wrote, and at least in some of his arrangements of the chapters, he put this one first. Currently, according to, I guess, the last revision he made, it's now third. But apparently he must have thought it was pretty important if he at times put it first. It's one of the best known and important chapters of the Shobogenzo. So this chapter, or sometimes they're called fascicles, I'm not sure where that fancy word came from, but that's what it's called a lot of times. It's said to be a summation of Dogen's lifetime teaching. In fact, the first 4 lines of the Genjo Koan are said to be not only a summation of the Genjo Koan chapter, but of the whole Shobogenzo itself. Just as the Heart Sutra, is said to be a summation of the great, long, diverse Prajnaparamita Sutras. It's a little summation. That's why it's called the Heart Sutra. It's the heart of the matter. So the same thing is said of these first 4 lines of Dogen's Genjo Koan. The term Genjo appears 2 times in the chapter itself, and it appears elsewhere in Dogen's writing several times. So the title Genjo Koan is usually translated as the koan of everyday life. Koan here is used in a very different way than we generally use it in Zen. We think of it as a story that's given to a student to come up with an answer. But here, it's used in a very different way. It means a place where the different ways of encountering reality intersect or come together. And according to Dharma, this place is everyday life, this very moment. So that's koan. Genjo means ultimate reality. So what do we mean by ultimate reality? It's the reality that's right in front of you. It's suchness, again, this very moment. It points to the reality that's beyond relative and absolute, beyond their difference and beyond their oneness. You know, there's the phrase, not one, they're not two. So what is beyond not being the same and not being different? This is what Dogen is trying to get at here in this Genjo Koan. It's, of course, quite unsayable, so he stands on his head trying to tell us what it is. You can watch him do this in Genjo Koan. So this Genjo Koan is about how we can reconcile the relative and the absolute points of view. As ideas, we can't reconcile them. They're completely opposed. They're logical opposites. So how can we bring these points of view into balance in our lives? And how can we work with them in a way that harmonizes them? So we're going to go through this first paragraph line by line and see if we can shed some light on it. So here's the paragraph. He says, when all dharmas are Buddha dharmas, there are delusion and realization, practice and Buddha dharmas. There are, I skipped a thing there. There are dharmas and Buddha dharmas. There are delusion and realization, practice, birth and death, Buddhas and living beings. So he's telling us what there is. And when realization, practice, birth and death, Buddhas and living beings, I can't read. And when the 10,000 dharmas are without self, there are no delusion, no realization, no Buddhas, no living beings, and no death. The Buddha way transcends being and non-being. Therefore, there are birth and death, delusion and enlightenment, living beings and Buddhas. Nevertheless, flowers fall though we love them, and weeds grow though we hate them. So that's the first paragraph here. So how is Dogen showing us ultimate reality in these lines? How is he showing us the different points of view from which we can look at reality? Okay, let's look at the first line. When all dharmas are Buddha dharmas, there are delusion and realization, practice, birth and death, Buddhas and living beings. So we've talked in the past about this word dharmas. It has more than one meaning. It means the ultimate law of the universe, the organization of reality. It means the Buddhist teachings. They're called dharmas too. And it also means things, phenomena, as in the 10,000 things. Each of those 10,000 things is a dharma. You're a dharma. So when Dogen speaks of all dharmas, he's talking about the many forms, the many phenomena of the world. When he calls them Buddha dharmas, he's discussing the teachings in Buddhism about phenomena. We know that we see phenomena from the relative point of view when we begin our practice. This is the world of form. This is the world where things are subject to karma. This is the world in which the laws of cause and effect operate. So those basically the relative world, the world of form. All of us enter practice with this point of view, which is basically everything's real. So when we're seeing things from this point of view, we see that there are both realization and delusion. In the relative world, we have to practice, because even though all beings have Buddha nature, we haven't realized it yet, so we have to practice. In the relative world, we experience both birth and death. We're human. We can't avoid birth and death, our own and the birth and death of many other things too. We acknowledge that we're fully human and that each of us has the potential to realize Buddhahood. So this is the point of view of the relative. This is the world of duality, of this and that, of you and me, of up and down. And we don't have too much trouble with this world until we become Zen students. Then we go all whooshy and say everything is one all the time. All right, so that's the first line. In the first line, he's presenting to you the relative world. Now here's the second line. He says, when the 10,000 dharmas are without self, there are no delusion, no realization, no Buddhas, no living beings, and no death. You know, this sort of reminds you a little bit of the Heart Sutra, where there are all these lists of no, eye, ear, nose, tongue, and there's other lists in there about what there is nothing of. So he's going to another point of view now. This is the point of view of the Absolute. In this line, he's taking us a little further along in our practice. Because if we are to see this larger reality that he's talking about more clearly, ultimately we have to expand our point of view from the relative. We have to leave the world of phenomena and duality, and we have to see that there's another way of looking at reality. That this world of relativity is true. It's a real world, but it's only a partial truth. You know, we don't let go of it altogether. What we do really is we see through it. We don't leave it. It's like the self, no self. You don't let go of yourself. You just see through yourself so that it doesn't have quite the heft and reality that you think it does when that's all you see. So we have to see through this ordinary world of reality to the world of the Absolute. We have to see that though all phenomenon have a provisional reality, that they're all ultimately empty. Dogen says we need to see that they are, quote, without self. If they are without self, then this is the same as saying they're empty. It's just another way of saying the same thing. So to be without self is to see that aspect of all things that is subject to constant change. You know, this is likely to be a fairly long talk. Dharma talks are not exactly like doing Zazen, though. You should try to put your mind in a kind of Zazen receptive place when you're listening. But you can, you know, wiggle your legs around and sit in a different way if you feel uncomfortable. So he's pointing out that when things are without self, it means they're subject to constant change. We see that all things are what they are because of the influence of change, the influence of other things. Through the activity of change, things affect all other things at all times. This is what we talk about as Indra's net, this big net of things, and everything is influencing everything else. Some things are influencing a little, and some things have big influence. Depends on how close they are in time and space, and how open you or something else is to the influence. But all things are influencing everything else at all times. And if you take one thing out, you shift the balance. If you add one thing, you shift the balance. So we say that all things arrive together. They arise together and they fall away or cease together. The Buddhist way of saying this is all things are interdependent. Nothing can stand on its self all alone, because it only arose because of the influence of other things in the first place. So it just can't be all by itself. So we say all things are interdependent. Everything is always connected to everything else. Another way of saying that everything is connected to everything else is to say all things are one. It's basically making the same statement. This is why Dogen says that when things have no self, then they don't exist as a permanent, independent phenomena. So he says they have no self when you're looking at them from the absolute point of view, the point of view of change and emptiness. In such a case, he says, there are no delusions, no realization, no Buddhas, no living beings, and no death. What that means may not be quite as simple as it sounds, but that is what he says. And basically what he's saying here is there's no anything when you look at it from this point of view. All is empty. So this is the point of view of the absolute. So he's given us the relative, now he's giving us the absolute. So he goes to the third line and he says something else. He says the Buddha way transcends being and non-being. So he's just given us these 2 point of views, and now he's going to go beyond relative and absolute. He's trying to teach us that there are more ways to look at reality apart from just form and emptiness. You know, we emphasize those 2 states in Zen a lot, and then we tend to get stuck there, that there's these 2 things, and never the twain shall meet. So he's saying, no, you have to look further. Both are true, the relative and the absolute, depending on how you're looking at it. But neither is the whole truth. So when he says the Buddha way transcends being and non-being, what he's saying is that the Buddhist way of seeing reality is bigger than either of these things. It's big, it's a very large, comprehensive point of view. To truly penetrate the way, then, we need to see beyond what the translation calls being and non-being. You know, another way of saying being and non-being could be form and emptiness. Non-being would be emptiness, being would be form. Being is form and non-being is emptiness. Being is the relative and non-being would be the absolute. We often quote lines in the Sutra of the Relative and Absolute that say, to encounter the absolute is not yet enlightenment. It's saying exactly the same thing that Dogen is saying here. Once you have seen the absolute, that's not it. You gotta enlarge your view a little. And then the second line that the identity of relative and absolute says is to be attached to things is illusion. Well, this is form. So what it's saying here is, if you're only in the relative, you're deluded. And if you're always in the absolute, you haven't got it yet either. Neither way is completely adequate to describe reality. So thus far, Dogen has been very logical in his presentation. Once you accept the premises, it's very logical. So he's presenting these teachings. It's this way, it's that way. Don't you see, you know? And he's basically saying, if you look at it from one point of view, the following thing is true. If you look at it from the other point of view, this other thing is true. Something different is true from the first way of looking at it. So now he's saying that neither of these views is exclusively true. He's trying to teach us that the Buddha view of reality is bigger and it's subtler than the relative and the absolute, than form and emptiness. What is beyond the relative and the absolute? What view is that? This is what Dogen is trying to show us in Genjo Koan, what it is. So in the fourth line, he goes on and he says, therefore, there are birth and death, delusion and enlightenment, living beings and Buddhas. Now here it sounds like he's going back to the first line again. He's saying almost the same thing. That delusion and realization, practice, birth, death, Buddhas, and living beings are. That's what he's saying again here. But this is not quite what he's saying. He's looking at it from a different perspective, a different point of view. The point of view of unity. You know, there's that other thing where they do this. I think it might be from Dogen too. It says, mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers. That would be form. After I had studied Dharma for a while, mountains were no longer mountains and rivers were no longer rivers. That would be the absolute. Saw through to their emptiness. And then the final line goes back again and sounds like the first line. It says, and now mountains are mountains again and rivers are rivers. So this is sort of what he's doing. He's going back to that, what sounds like the first position. Because Zen students get lost in the absolute. So he's reminding them, yes, the absolute is true, but don't forget that there's something else here. The world is real in its own way. So here he's going to unity, and the Heart Sutra tells us about this all the time. We'll be chanting it at the end today. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. So one way of looking at reality is that there's no difference between what he's pointing out to be form and emptiness. No difference between relative and absolute. So because there's no difference between them, Dogen is telling us once again, there are all these things: delusion, realization, practice, birth, death, Buddhas, and living beings. So how does he arrive at this conclusion? He doesn't really spell out each step of his logic here, but it would go something like this. The implications of what he's teaching is that all forms are empty. But here's the thing. We can only encounter emptiness in form. Emptiness doesn't float around out there all by itself as some like amorphous fog or something. It always has to be the emptiness of some thing, some phenomena. So form and emptiness always occur together. According to the identity of the relative and absolute, it says they occur together like a box and its lid, like two arrows meeting in midair. No hindrance. It's easy the way they fit. It's hard to understand, but it's easy the way it actually works in reality. So this is what he's saying. This is now the third point of view. That when we have emptiness, we have form, because emptiness can only occur in form. When we have form, we have emptiness, because all forms are empty. So this is how he concludes. Once again, there are delusion, realization, blah, 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 all these things. In the very heart of emptiness lies form. At the very heart of form lies emptiness. And so this is how the Buddha way transcends being and non-being. So then he goes on. This is the final sentence of the paragraph, the 5th line. He says, nevertheless, flowers fall, though we love them, and weeds grow, though we hate them. So this is a departure, right? He's been presenting this very logical, progressive kind of reasoning. And here he just goes into a whole bunch of metaphors and poetic images. He wants to express the truth fully about reality. And the logical approach is not going to serve him here. So he's giving us something else. He's giving us poetry. The most profound truths are basically unsayable. So he's not trying to say them as an idea. He's just giving us some images. He begins this last sentence with a transitional word that is logical, however. He says, nevertheless. So he's saying all these things are true, and because they are true, this final thing is true. So he's introducing his poetic language as a logical conclusion to the first part of his paragraph. So with these images, Dogen is introducing 2 new elements of the Dharma into this paragraph. He wants to influence the way we see things through them. He wants to give us some hints about how we could balance the various ways of looking at reality. Here he's talking about love and hate, desire and aversion, another way of saying it. You remember last year, right around this time, we were doing the Faith Mind Sutra, and it had the line, when love and hate are both absent, everything becomes clear and undisguised. That sutra is very similar to Dogen in the same way that it constantly changed points of view. So Dogen is going to go into that territory now. He's pointing out that we love flowers and we hate weeds. Kind of, but, as a gardener, I'll tell you it's literally true. But it's not just literal here. If we dig into the metaphor a little, we can connect it to some other things that Dogen wants to talk about. Weeds are often used as a metaphor for delusion. You can see why. The weeds growing in your mind. And the flower is often an image of realization, enlightenment, the blooming, the flowering of realization. So Dogen, ever the monk, is talking here about practice, and he's thinking about how all of us, when we practice, are hot in pursuit of enlightenment and very averse to our delusions. And more than this, this formula applies to everything in our lives. We're always grasping after something, or we're desperately trying to get rid of something in our life. Always discriminating between what we like and what we don't like. So this is Dogen's point. He's showing us the basic problem that we have. We have it in practice and we have it in our everyday lives. These are the questions he poses to us. How do I make choices? How can I not always jump around, making choices at times from the point of view of emptiness and at other times from the point of view of form? How can I know which point of view is skillful in which situation? How should I see it? So this aversion and grasping is about desire. What desire does in our lives is it makes them narrow, and it shapes our experience before we've ever had it. It makes us come to conclusions about things before we even see what they are. It means we're not open to everything when we're desiring something specific. It's a very small, tight way to live. And it leads to suffering for us and for the others that we come in contact with. So what Dogen is getting at here is what we call it, Zen Center of Philadelphia, life as it is. Because this life contains many, many things, and Dogen wants us to be open to all those things. The things we don't like, as well as the things we desire. We have to be open to our difficulties, to our sorrow, to our loneliness, all things we would like to push away. We don't have to be happy about these things and welcome them with balloons and candles, cake, but we do have to let them in and experience them fully. What we try to do is we try to limit our experience only to joy and pleasure. And we try to do this by cutting off and separating from our suffering. But when we do this, things end badly. We can't just feel a joyous emotional range. When we try to cut off the feeling of suffering, we cut off all feeling. When we cut off feeling, we cut off joy and pleasure as well as suffering. And we end up leading these kind of numb lives of quiet despair. So you gotta let it all in. So this is Dogen's message in this paragraph. Life as it is, the only teacher. Don't miss it. It's your life. Even the painful parts, live them. This is how we live with authenticity. This is how we live with vitality. So this is the first of our Genjo Koan talks. You'll see in the rest of this chapter as we talk about it, that just as in the first paragraph, Dogen constantly switches around from one point of view to another as he presents his ideas, and he constantly reverts to poetic images when things get too tough and he doesn't know how to say them in logic. And he also uses koans in this way. You know, the first talk I gave you was about the koan about the master fanning himself. You know, he makes certain points with koans also that are not logical but true. So this is why he's so hard to understand, and this is why he's so profound. So as your ear attunes a little more to the way he handles ideas, you'll pick it up a little more readily of how he's constantly switching back and forth.